Okay. We're starting about on time. For August 2025, dis and dat information. Martha Campbell on credit in Capital Volume 3. Note, of course, we've been going through a lot of chapters of this particular book by Campbell, edited by Campbell and Rutan, Geert Rutan, and it's a useful text, among others, but this one's fairly recent, and we've gone through chapters by Chris Arthur and, a variety of folks, not everyone who's been writing about this, but since in the last couple of days, we've been looking at versions of Volume 3. For example, the economic manuscripts of 1864 to 65. And once one starts rethinking those, then you begin to see a sense of what is or isn't Marx's writing as opposed to Engels' editing, and a variety of other thoughts and ideas, including questions as today on credit. We looked at rent before and a variety of other things. And needless to say, there are a few topics that remain open for analysis and that are relevant in terms of looking at Capital Volume 3, for which we are preparing, hopefully in preparation for an upcoming lecture series in the fall. So it is quite available, the text, and I recommend it to you because I think it really is fairly recent and useful, the culmination of Capital essays on Volume 3 of Marx's Capital. Number 9, the credit system. In describing the objective of Part 5 of Capital Volume 3, Marx states that he is considering the credit system only to the extent necessary to characterize the capitalist mode of production in general. As this indicates, the credit system is, in Marx's view, so essential that no presentation of capital would be complete without it. It points also to a distinctive feature of Marx's account, namely that he derives the credit system from capital, which he initially presents as industrial capital by itself. That is, he appeals to the requirements and inherent tendencies of industrial capital to explain why the credit system evolves. Starting from industrial capital, however, poses a problem for Marx. To show that capital creates the credit system requires an understanding of what capital is and how it operates. But capital, being what it is, cannot be conceived at all without money. Marx handles this problem by starting with commodity money, giving rise to much criticism and bafflement. If, as will be argued here, Marx demonstrates that capital creates the credit system, then he never meant to leave money as commodity money. That is, to suggest that capitalism operates with commodity money. This is simply the form of money capital does not create, but inherits from previous society. It's a presupposition, isn't it? It's a pre-existing thing. Since, according to Marx, any form of money is a universal equivalent, characteristics of the universal equivalent identified in Capital Volume 1 are preserved in bank money. In particular, the indirectly social character of capitalist production and the objectivity of value which results from it figure prominently in Marx's argument in Capital Volume 3. One consequence of this argument is that bank money emerges as the form of money specific to capitalism, replacing the troublesome commodity money of Volume 1. The first section of this chapter examines the reasons Marx gives to explain why capitalism produces the credit system. The second section considers the effects of the credit system on the functioning of capital, chief among which are its collapse or financial crises, which is kind of, where we're headed at the end. Since Marx refers again to metallic money in connection with crises, the third section examines what he means by the collapse of the credit system, noting, of course, that metallic money is kind of an important, not a default so much as it is a supposition in order to get his argument working. Number one, Section 1, the evolution of the credit system. In Capital Volume 1, before Marx takes the credit system into account, he treats money as given by the original accumulations, the primitive accumulation. Remember, this is what original refers to. Together with the other prerequisites for production, it is presented as the property of capitalists. It constitutes the fund capital needs to begin its circuit. When Marx returns to money in Capital Volume 3, he revises this first account. Here, the credit system, consisting of the banking system and the bond and stock markets, takes the place of the original accumulation. It supplies all forms of capital, including capitals within the credit system itself or interest-bearing capital, with advances of money and of money capital. Marx supplies the basis for this switch between Volume 1 and Volume 3 accounts by his argument that the credit system evolves of its own accord within capitalism because it removes barriers to the expansion of capital. This section considers the reasons he gives for its evolution. Marx presents two complementary lines of argument to explain why the credit system develops. Along one line, he argues that the banking system develops to overcome the limits of trade or commercial credit. This type of credit arises when one capitalist sells commodities to another in exchange for a bill of exchange, a promise to pay by a certain date, rather than for money. Trade credit can be extended beyond two capitalists to the group of capitalists that is linked by regular transactions because the different individual capitals in it carry out different stages of the circuit of one product. Within such a group, the bill arising in one transaction can, in turn, be used by the creditor to buy on credit. Footnote 3. Marx includes the development of clearinghouses for bills within the limits of trade credit. These enhance the circulation of bills because they allow reciprocal debts to cancel out each other. The reason to replace money with credit is that this reduces both the total capital and the amount of capital in money. For example, in idle form of money that each capitalist needs in order to function. Commercial credit, however, can only replace money to a limited extent. Capitalists must still use money in transactions with non-capitalists, particularly workers, but also the state. They also cannot use credit whenever the seller's commodity belongs to a different nexus of transactions than the buyer's. The seller cannot use the buyer's bill as a means of purchase and so will not accept it. The most important limitation, however, is that with commercial credit by itself, capitalists are dependent on the timing of sales and must hold money reserves to meet their debts in case sales returns are delayed. See the 1894 edition, page 611. According to Marx, the banking system represents an advance over commercial credit because it eliminates this last reason for holding money. And this is the crux of some current issues in terms of reserves. The distinctive characteristic of the banking system is that it concentrates the total money reserves in society into one pool for use by all individual capitals. This socialization of money for capital is the hallmark of the credit system. Because it is missing from commercial credit, the latter, as de Brunoff says, is on the borderline between the monetary and credit system. Footnote 5. Banks lend from this fund by issuing their own promises to pay, either as banknotes or as bank deposits. And these are what are called credit money. Footnote 6. The existence of banks allows commercial credit to be transformed into credit money by the practice of discounting. This is the purchase by a bank of bills of exchange with bank notes. Since bank debt, unlike bills, does not have a payment due date, discounting is an advance of money, constitutes an advance of money. Once non-financial capitalists can have bills discounted, they can accept bills from a wider range of other capitalists and are freed from the necessity of holding money reserves against delays in sales returns. Marx's second line of explanation is that the credit system develops from the hoards required for the circulation of capital. With the concentration of all hoards in the banking system, banks become the general managers of money capital in charge of the system of payment and of lending. Page 528. This is the socialization of money for capital, which evolves because of the advantages it entails for capital. The amount of money required to support any given level of economic activity is reduced, not only because all capitalists share the hoard, but also because banks need to hold as money only the fraction of their debts that they are, on average, asked to redeem. Now, the point of both sides of argument is that the credit system is the specific product of capitalism because, in numerous ways, it overcomes barriers to the expansion of capital. With the credit system, first, both money lending and the source of money become internal to the capitalist economy. Banks, as intermediaries, are links between capitalist lenders and capitalist borrowers, robbing usurers' capital of its monopoly. Page 738. Likewise, the creation of credit money by the banking system restricts the monopoly of the precious metals. Now, second, the credit system liberates capital's expansion by reducing the quantity and costs of capital in money form. The substitution of credit between capitalists for money functioning as means of circulation is essential, given that capitalism produces for sale and on a massive scale. Without credit, the nation's capital would have to double so that commerce would purchase the entire national product with its own capital before selling it again. Page 612. The availability of the banking system to individual capitalists eliminates the need for them to hold reserves for the circulation of capital. The near monies that take the place of reserves, that is, loans to banks and holdings of securities, collect surplus value. Fractional bank reserves mean that the reserve fund of the business community is restricted to a necessary minimum. Page 528. Further, the cost to capital of borrowing money is reduced, since bankers lend at lower interest rates because they specialize in evaluating borrowers. Footnote 11. Third, the socialization of capital through the securities markets and the banking system liberates capital's inherent impulse to expand from the limits of previously accumulated capital, allowing a tremendous expansion in the scale of production and enterprises that would be impossible for individual capitals. Page 567, footnote 12. Last, the credit system distributes capital over the economy as a whole, and in this way unifies all individual capitals into one total social capital. It is therefore the means for equalizing the rate of profit on different capitals. This equalization, or the movement toward it, is the law, quote, on which the whole of capitalist production depends. Page 566. In all the following respects, the evolution of the credit system embodies the free development of capital, positing itself in the forms adequate to it. Now, Marx, it should be noted, is not particularly interested in giving a full account of credit money. He specifically states this is beyond the scope of his plan. Page 525. It seems likely that the integrating aspect of the credit system referred to last is the most significant point for Marx. As will be argued in the next section, the interconnection established by the credit system among all individual capitals is a precondition for crisis. Section 2, consequences of the credit system. While on the one hand, the credit system evolves because it overcomes barriers to the expansion of capital, it also allows real capital to expand, at least temporarily, past barriers that are still in force. In addition, it takes off on its own independently of the reproduction of real capital. On the other hand, because the credit system overcomes barriers by the socialization of capital, it increases the interconnections among individual capitals, which increases the complexity of the capitalist economy. Now, socialization also reduces the total reserve, which increases the fragility of the system. That is, you have more agents, etc. These two characteristic features of the credit system taken together mean that when the delayed barriers assert their existence, the result is a crisis that is generalized to all capitals. Now, to elaborate the first point, the independence of the credit system is inherent in interest-bearing capital, as emerges most starkly from Marx's account of interest-bearing capital apart from the institutional forms of the credit system. It's chapters 21 through 24 of Volume 3 of Capital. The circuit of interest-bearing capital is completely external to the reproduction of real capital, meaning industrial and commercial capital. This separateness, in turn, is the reason for the doubling of claims that pervades all aspects of the credit system. For example, one by real capital, or in fact by any borrower, and the other associated with a financial asset or any lender. Borrowers and lenders. It is also the reason why the rate of interest is arbitrary. Since interest-bearing capital does not carry out any part of the reproduction of real capital, there is no value basis for the division between interest and profit of enterprise. Footnote 15. Last, it is the reason why the credit system is the source of illusions. With commercial credit by itself, credit is given to a buyer only to accomplish the sale of commodities. Even if bills embody prices that ultimately cannot be realized, they're inextricably tied to the circulation of real capital. When bills are discounted by the banking system, that is, when they join the credit system proper, however, they can become detached from the circuit of the real capital to which they correspond and appropriate other capital. Now, this does not occur with the discount of a normal bill, which simply involves an advance of money. The bill corresponds to some intermediate stage of the value of commodities, which are in process towards their final form and will be paid by the revenue from their final sale. Now, by discounting the bill, the banker anticipates this final sale or pre-validates it. In an expansion, normal bills may be discounted so that the reproduction of capital can speed up or proceed on a larger scale. By contrast, the discount of accommodation bills, meaning bills that do not represent any real transactions, masquerades as an exchange of money now for money later, but involves an advance of money capital because the bill is fictitious or represents no real value, but its seller receives value in money form from the bank when it is discounted. Page 674. Now, since Marx regards banks as intermediaries, in his words, the seller of an accommodation bill gets his hands on other people's capital. Page 555. Because normal bills may turn into accommodation bills with a decline in prices or a halt in sales, the two are often indistinguishable in practice. Footnote 17. Once an advance is made, it is unclear whether it was an advance of liquidity or an advance of capital. That is, whether the advance is repaid by the sale of commodities corresponding to the bill, meaning that the sale just required extra time, or whether it is repaid out of the circuit of a new capital. The transformation of normal into accommodation bills is virtually inevitable since it occurs on a regular basis at the end of economic expansions. Credit, which in the expansion corresponds to an increase in the speed and scale of the circulation of real capital, turns into credit that merely allows production to continue past the time when final sales have slowed. Footnote 18. In this way, the credit system allows industrial capital and commercial capital to outstrip realization, as de Bronhoff says, deferring the limits of money circulation. The impulse for expansion lies in the tremendous elasticity of the reproduction process, page 419. Capital is, by nature, always ready to pursue the production process past its capitalist barriers, page 640, since the scale of production is determined more by the quantity of capital and the need of the capitalist production process for continuity and extension. Now, by anticipating value realization, for example, by pre-validating bills, the credit system gives capital's impulse to expand freer rein. The other credit system duplicates the other credit system duplicates of real capital, such as bonds and stocks, are from the outset less connected to the circulation of their corresponding real capital than commercial credit. As interest-bearing capital, stocks and bonds, their circuit is external to that of real capital to begin with. They become further detached from real capital in a variety of ways. Most straightforwardly, their value is determined by capitalization independently of the value of real capital and varies with the interest rate and supply and demand. Detachment from real capital is carried further when financial assets are issued by parties other than commercial capitalists and industrial capitalists. Marx's statement, page 735, that interest-bearing capital within capitalism is distinguished from usurer's capital before capitalism by the, quote, transformed figure of the borrower, close quote, as an industrialist or merchant is, in fact, an idealization. With capitalization, any regular revenue seems to arise from a capital value, which capital then seems to be the revenue source. Now, because the credit system inverts shares into sources of surplus value, anyone with a regular revenue may borrow by issuing financial assets. Besides borrowing by real capital, interest-bearing capital may lend to itself. Landowners may obtain mortgages, and governments issue securities. The final and most striking step in detachment is speculation in financial assets based on their expected future price, rather than their more distant connection to surplus value. Footnote 19. Now, the second aspect, the increased complexity and fragility of the reproduction of capital, is introduced by commercial credit. This enhances fragility because it imposes a time constraint on the final sale of commodities. It adds to complexity because all capitals participating in the reproduction of one commodity are linked by the circulation of the same bill. All are therefore dependent on the sale of that commodity at its expected price. Failure to sell in the specified time or at the expected price leads to forced sales to meet debt commitments, and therefore to deflation. Footnote 20. The pressure to sell may be alleviated temporarily by discounting bills. Ultimately, however, the credit system reproduces these same characteristics on a larger scale. The range of interconnections among individual capitals is extended as, quote, advances among industrialists and merchants fuse, close quote, in the banking system, page 614. Credit money enters circulation through discounting bills, As Marx emphasized, the circulation of credit money is determined by the circulation of bills rather than by simple monetary circulation. They're in kind of parallel. Page 525. This means that it involves the same interconnections as bills, that like bills, it's associated with forced sales, and also that it functions as means of payment rather than as means of purchase. Footnote 21. Reliance on interest-bearing capital imposes narrower limits on the acceptable rate of gross profit, raising its lower limit to the rate of interest. Now, because the reserve of money is reduced to the minimum reserve required on average, it is insufficient for the exceptional circumstances that always arise. Footnote 22. Now, the really crucial aspect of fragility, however, is that all credit shares the same fate. When the collapse comes, good credit that would have been socially validated is devalued along with bad credit issued in connection with speculation and fraud. Footnote 23. Marx describes the crisis as an attempt to transform all credit into money. There's a liquidity issue, obviously. Since money is only a fraction of credit, this transformation cannot be accomplished because individual capitals have replaced money reserves with bank deposits and securities. When they are unable to meet debt commitments, the commodity price deflation that would have occurred without the credit system is replaced by bank runs and security market crashes. This is the whole thing why you have central banks and the Fed, blah, blah, blah. In summary, with the credit system, capitalism creates its own form of money. That is, its own more liberal method of financing capital's expansion. And with financial assets, a completely novel kind of asset that, by its detachment from real capital, involves its own principle of pricing. The overextension of reproduction relative to final realization, together with this increased fragility, means that any restriction on credit acts as the feather which, added to the weight already on the scales, is enough to tip the balance, close quote, page 705. Complexity ensures that all capitals are caught in the same net. All commodities and all financial assets have to prove their value by being transformed into money. This, quote unquote, collapse of credit into the monetary system, as Marx calls it, involves the discredit of all credit, that is, bank runs and the devaluation of financial assets. Section 3, the collapse of the credit system. The credit system promotes the expansion of capital, but financial crises are evidence that the reproduction of capital is still subject to constraints. The assertion of these constraints is merely delayed by the operation of the credit system. As de Bruynhoff says, the credit system defers limits of money circulation, but does not suppress them. It defers limits of money circulation, but does not suppress them. Now, a problem arises in connection with Marx's account in Capital Vol III regarding how far the collapse of the credit system proceeds. If the credit system is created by capital, as Marx maintains, then once it is developed, it should remain a permanent part of capitalism. In other words, the assertion in a crisis of the constraint on capital's reproduction should not abolish the credit system itself. Marx's references to gold money, however, could be taken to suggest precisely this, that the credit system is eliminated by its collapse so that capitalism reverts back to the pre-capitalist form of money. You can see how that kind of is implied. To resolve this problem, this section examines what Marx means by the collapse of the credit system. Now, regarding the constraints on the reproduction of capital, 2 points should be noted. The first point, Marx discusses the credit system entirely within the context of the distribution of surplus value among capitals. The credit system introduces a new principle of profit and loss for individual capitals. As Marx observes, within the credit system, gambling now appears in place of labor as the original source of capital ownership. Page 609. The gambling he has in mind involves transactions in securities, that is, in fictitious capital by which winners get their hands on other people's capital or expropriate capital and surplus value from each other. Now, while this really is a source of capital for individuals, both Marx's reference to, quote unquote, other people's capital and the context in which he discusses the credit system suggests that gambling cannot add to the total value of capital. By contrast, when Marx presents the exploitation of labor as the source of surplus value in Capital Volume 1, the case he makes is that this is the only possible source of a net increase in surplus value for capital as a whole. Thus, the idea that gambling is as a source of capital, that gambling is a source of capital, must be one of the illusions generated by the credit system, footnote 25. Second, the particular way the credit system defers constraints is that credit of all kinds, that is commercial credit, banking credit, the securities market, is based on expected prices, in Marx's terminology, on ideal rather than realized value, footnote 26. Lender and borrower share confidence in the social character of production, and this confidence makes the money form of products appear as something evanescent and ideal. That is, as superfluous and a mere formality, pages 707 to 8. It is a matter of confidence rather than objective evidence because the society of two, that is, the lender and the borrower, cannot impose their evaluation on society at large. In other words, the credit system inherently operates on the pretense that indirectly social, that is, private and independent production, is directly social. Let me repeat that. In other words, the credit system inherently operates on the pretense that indirectly social, that is, private and independent production, private production and independent production, is directly social. Credit versus money merely repeats the opposition between private and social that obtains between value in commodity form, that is the ideal, and value in money form realized. Let me repeat that. Credit versus money merely repeats the opposition between private and social that obtains between value in commodity form, that is the ideal, and value in money form realized, the realized. Now, Marx indicates early in Capital Volume 1 that this is the opposition that becomes plain in a crisis. Quote, the antithesis between commodities and their value form, comma, money, appears as an absolute contradiction. Now, this opposition is fundamental to capitalism. Marx first presents it in terms of simple circulation, but it is preserved throughout Capital, the book, as the volumes, as he develops the more complex aspects of capitalism. Footnote 27. It is not overcome simply by the change in money's form from precious metal to bank money. Hence, Marx adds that in a crisis, the monetary famine remains whether payments have to be made in gold or in credit money, stinking badges. Thus, one meaning of Marx's claim that the credit system is not emancipated from the money system is that ideal values, provisionally validated by credit, must ultimately be realized, page 727. This is the original and most basic monetary constraint. It has nothing to do with the metallic form of money. While in Capital Volume 1, Marx suggests that credit money still functions as money in a crisis, so that at least this part of the credit system is preserved. In Capital Volume 3, he states that, quote, precious metal remains the foundation from which the credit system can never break free, close quote, page 741. Now, in part, statements to this effect refer to the regulations established by the Bank Act of 1844, which make the creation of central bank money conditional on a gold reserve. This regulation forces the central bank to cease acting as a lender of last resort, whenever the gold reserve is reduced. Private banks, in turn, must refuse to discount bills because they would lack sufficient reserves to meet their own liabilities. Commercial credit is thereby detached from the banking system. The credit system is eliminated in the sense that credit reverts to commercial credit by itself outside the credit system, i.e., with no access to the pool of funds that the credit system actually creates. The restriction of loans by the central bank would have the same effect, no matter why the central bank imposes the restriction. The quantity of gold just happens to occasion this restriction in the institutional framework established by the Bank Act, footnote 29. Now, since for Marx, the definitive characteristic of the credit system is the creation of a pool of funds accessible to all capitalists, in part also the collapse of the credit system just means the denial of access to that pool of funds. Now, Marx speaks of this as hoarding, but by this he means the refusal of banks to discount bills, that is, to lend. Keynes's comment on hoarding is perfectly compatible with Marx's argument. As Keynes notes, since, quote, it is impossible for the actual amount of hoarding to change as a result of decisions on the part of the public, close quote, hoarding cannot mean the actual hoarding of cash. Keynes, therefore, substitutes propensity to hoard for hoarding. An increase in the propensity to hoard resulting in an increase in the rate of interest rather than an increase in the quantity of cash held. And this is kind of fundamental to a whole bunch of other things. This same substitution can be made in Marx's account. It implies only that a spike in the rate of interest is one of the manifestations of hoarding. Now, these meanings of the collapse of the credit system do not entail a reversion to gold money, as many might try to posit. Moreover, Marx knows that the tie between credit money and gold exists only because it is established by the Bank Act. It would be strange if he considered this tie to be necessary, since he regards the Bank Act as foolish. In opposition to it, Marx argues that no tie between credit money and gold is necessary domestically. This leaves gold as world money, footnote 31. Now, Marx emphasizes, however, that capital transcends national boundaries, since he argues that capital creates credit money as its own form of money. It would be inconsistent to maintain that it's necessarily tied to pre-capitalist money at the international level. This suggests all kinds of things about trade as well. Now, even if we suppose that Marx is deceived by the institutions of his day, however, his references to gold make a point that still applies to credit money. This is that capitalism is intrinsically uncontrollable. It is a system of production that is, capitalism is a system of production that is socially determined to the core, except in the respect that it is not subject to social control. Now, for this reason, value, that is the social character of products, appears as an objective property of products. As Marx emphasizes, it seems to be their property, not ours. The objectivity of value stems from the indirectly social, in other words, simultaneously private and social, character of production. The entire significance of money as universal equivalent is that it mediates, that is, allows the existence of this contradiction. It allows the contradiction, but does not remove it. Footnote 32. Money accomplishes this mediation by being the thing external to the commodity that stands for the commodity's social character or value. Now, since this same opposition between commodity and money is repeated in the opposition between credit and money, in discussing the credit system and its collapse, Marx speaks again of money as a thing, quote unquote. Now, by this, he means not that money is gold, but that money is the social character of production, which is a very important point, which must take the form of a thing because production is indirectly rather than directly social. That this is Marx's meaning is shown by his constant association between money as a thing and the contradictions between private and social. That is, money is in, quote, is in actual fact nothing but a special expression of the social character of labor and its products, which, however, as antithetical to the basis of private production, must always present itself in the last instance as a thing. Pages 742 to 743. Quote Marx on 707, this social existence that is money or gold as money, thus appears as something beyond, as a thing, object, or commodity outside and alongside the real elements of social wealth. On 708, the collapse of the credit system shows strikingly by its effects that production is not really subjected to social control as social production, and that the social form of wealth exists alongside wealth itself as a thing. Page 708. This is, you've got to work through this. As still Marx, as long as the social character of labor appears as the monetary existence of the commodity, and hence as a thing outside actual production, monetary crises are unavoidable. That's page 649, and it's footnote 34. It is methodologically simpler to express the objectivity of value in gold money because credit money and the bank regulations associated with it create the appearance of government control of the economy, footnote 35. The Bank Act of 1844 is one attempt at monetary policy intended both to regulate the value of money and to make crises impossible once and for all, page 688. Now, that the Bank Act actually brings about and intensifies crises does not say much for social planning. The deliberations of Parliament, which Marx cites so extensively in this volume, do not inspire confidence either. From Marx's perspective, it is ridiculous to suppose that these experts, who have no idea what capital is, will devise a means of overcoming the crises inherent in capitalism, footnote 36. Even if the central bank can learn to act so that it's not itself the source of financial crises, it does not have a free hand. The arbitrariness of the interest rate allows some leeway for institutional determination, but this only favors financial capital at the expense of industrial capital and commercial capital, or vice versa. The central bank cannot create value by increasing credit money. If its pre-validation of credit is not confirmed by value realization, it only engages in a pseudo-social validation, which benefits some factions of society at others' expense. That is, it redistributes value, footnote 37. Now, in Marx's view, at least, as long as production decisions are left to the market, money, since it realizes value, is the thing by which social conflict among capitalists and between capitalists and workers is managed. In this sense, credit money is just as much a thing as gold money. Section 4, conclusion. So we're at the end, and we're going to stop a little early today. Conclusion. This chapter has focused on Marx's case that capital creates the credit system. By his account, the credit system emerges because it allows capital to internalize money and finance and to overcome, as well as disregard, factors that would otherwise constrain expansion. As has been argued also, Marx's description of the collapse of the credit system do not imply the abolition of the credit system itself. His references to gold are instead appeals to the objectivity of value. Now, for these reasons, Marx's presentation of the credit system in Capital Volume 3 should be taken as a revision of his presentation of money in Volume 1. It is one of the intentional revisions entailed by his method. In this instance, Marx needed the results established in both Volume 1 and 2 to show why the credit system emerges from capital. On this interpretation, Marx not only recognizes that the modern form of money is bank money, but he shows why money in capitalism necessarily takes this form. And so we've gotten to the end of that. Now, the important point, of course, is to mention how credit operates, its relation to debt, for example, and then there's a whole bunch of other things that are possible there. But, we want to restrict this to certain elements that allow Marx's argument to move fairly smoothly through this, and acknowledging that there are complexities, and this chapter has pointed out that way. And Campbell, in a 1998 text, footnote 38, for a discussion of the aspects of the credit system that emerge in Capital Volume 2, Campbell has an article. Pseudo-social validation as extra money is certainly an interesting idea and worthy of a discussion elsewhere under all kinds of other analysis, interpretive methods, including, being more literal about fiction, looking at sort of anthropomorphized versions of this. We see that every day on television. There's other things that one can address, and so therefore, the bibliography for this chapter is from Riccardo Bellafiore on Marxian Economics and Appraisal, Volume 1 of 1998. So there's that, and then the remainder of the bibliography includes some pretty interesting ones, including Suzanne de Brunhoff's magisterial text on Marx on money, among other things. Keynes, of course, and Rutten and Williams on value form in the state. Schaefold's relationship between rate of profit and the rate of interest. Now, this is actually an important point that needs to be explicated further, particularly because of the third volume. And then De Vroij's work of 84 on inflation, a non-monetarist monetary interpretation, and then, of course, Wolfson's financial crises. Anyway, a good selection of things. Now, I'm ending this early. I don't see any questions. So what I'm going to do is close the live stream. Tomorrow, we're going to look at another thing, and it could be from these things related to Volume 3, or we may start the Anwar Sheikh stuff again. We have to do that simply because these all interlock.